Today we're going to cover a case suggested by you, the viewers. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Before we do get started, I just want to say that extreme viewer discretion is advised for this case. We will be talking about a graphic and truly disturbing crime, so viewer discretion is advised. Those who knew 10-year-old Takoda Collins said that he was a happy-go-lucky child who was always smiling, even as a baby. Takoda was said to be an avid reader who was exceptionally intelligent and had a creative streak. In 2018, Al McLean would take his then 9-year-old child, Takoda Collins, and remove him from his elementary school in Ohio. Although there was speculation of abuse prior to Al removing his child from his elementary school, no one could ever imagine the nightmare that would await Takoda Collins from that point forward. Takoda Collins was forced to live in an unfinished attic of his biological father's home. This attic had no furniture or a light source. There was no running water or food or clothing or toys or books. Nothing that a 10-year-old boy would need in his bedroom. Takoda wasn't actually allowed to leave the attic without permission, and most of the time it was locked. So when Takoda had to use the restroom, he pretty much would hold it until he couldn't hold it anymore. And when it would become too painful and he had to relieve himself, he had no choice but to go in the attic on the floor. When Al McLean realized that Takoda had relieved himself on the attic floor, Al would do something completely despicable. He became so enraged that he forced Takoda to eat his own feces. Takoda begged his father not to force him to do this. He pleaded with him, but Al McLean wouldn't hear it. He went downstairs, he grabbed gloves, and then he force-fed feces to his own child. Eventually, the innocent child, Takoda Collins, would realize that was expected of him. So anytime he had to use the bathroom and he wasn't allowed downstairs, after he relieved himself, he would just eat the feces so that he didn't enrage Al McLean and he wasn't force-fed. For entire 20-hour days, Takoda Collins was forced to pose in these bizarre and uncomfortable positions for punishment. And most of the time, he was forced to do so while he was naked. And not only would Al McLean dish out abuse, his fiance Amanda and her sister, who also lived at the house, would take part in the abuse of this child. And he's forced to hold these really uncomfortable poses for long periods of time. And we're talking hours. If he fell from one of these poses or just couldn't hold it any longer because his muscles were so tired, he would be beaten by Al McLean. Al McLean would have to make a 911 call to report that Takoda Collins was unresponsive. And instead of focusing on getting help for his unresponsive son, Al McLean would focus on his cover story. He was basically trying to create an alibi at this point. Al would tell the dispatcher how difficult it was to be Takoda's parent, and that he would eat his own feces, and that he was uncontrollable, and that Takoda would hurt himself to try to get Al's attention. Obviously, the dispatcher on the other line is focused on Takoda. This person wants to make sure that this child is okay. So the dispatcher instructs Al to give Takoda CPR. And on the actual 911 recording, according to court documents, Al McLean can be heard in the background retching. He's trying to throw up. He's so disgusted by what is happening. And he even complained that it, quote, "it smells rotten inside of his stomach." And what he means is it smells rotten inside of Takoda Collins, his 10-year-old son's stomach. And that should tell you everything you need to know about the state of Takoda Collins at this point. Eventually, a police officer and medics arrive on scene, and while medics tend to this 10-year-old boy, the police officer brings Al McLean on the porch to allow them space to do their job. And as the medics are working on Takoda, Al is standing outside talking to this police officer, telling him how uncontrollable and uncivilized Takoda is, and that he eats his own feces and he inflicts wounds on himself. And then eventually, when paramedics came to Al and said that Takoda had passed away, all Al would muster up is, "All right, I tried to get you guys here as fast as I could." There's no show of emotion. He was not distraught. He didn't seem to care that his 10-year-old son was dead. During the autopsy, the doctor would note that Takoda had bruises from head to toe. And I'm not using that as as an expression, he actually had bruising from his head down to his toes. There was no part of his body left untouched by bruises. The autopsy also noted that there was plenty of defensive wounds, so he had defensive wounds on his arms and things like that from covering his face and trying to lessen the beating. It also revealed that there was even bruising that was hidden by his hair. The autopsy would confirm there was extensive blunt force injuries, 8 abrasions and contusions to the head, torso, and extremities, evidence of acute fresh injuries and healing injuries. So the acute fresh injuries were probably injuries that happened just recently, including that day, and there had been injuries that were healing. And not only did he have numerous bruises, he had broken bones as well, and there was 4 letters branded onto his back, one of which was a T. There was also evidence of rape. And although the document goes into some pretty graphic detail, I think it's better we leave it at that. I will end by quoting the doctor. The doctor said that these injuries were typically seen with a catastrophic event, something like a severe car accident. So while Takoda was taken from the house, police stayed on scene to examine the house. After all, there was a 10-year-old dead and they needed to know why. Detectives would note that the house was fully furnished, although there was feces from dogs everywhere. There were pictures on the walls of pets and family, but there's no pictures of a 10-year-old Takoda Collins. They also noted that there was a bedroom for a 3-year-old that was fully furnished with a bed. It had toys and books and clothes and everything you would need for a 3-year-old. But they would quickly realize there was nothing for a 10-year-old. There was no clothing or books or even toys. So as police continue to search the home, they soon realize that in the living room is access way to an attic. So they pull down the stairs and they are hit with a smell of urine and feces right away. So they make their way up the stairs and the first thing they notice is there's no light. They had to actually pull out their flashlights to look around. They notice it's dark and barren. There's no furniture except a broken chair. They notice there is no toys, no books, no clothing, no food. There's pretty much nothing in the attic except feces and bugs and urine. Eventually, one of the officers would locate the 2 broken chair legs downstairs. One had been stuffed behind a TV, and another was in a laundry basket sitting outside the bathroom door, which seemed like an odd place to place broken chair legs. So as police are in the attic and they have their flashlights out and they're kind of looking around and moving around slowly, they realize that there's another room in the attic, but it's locked. So after having Al unlock the door, they open it and they see just a lawn chair and a bloody tarp. And police would ultimately learn that this is where Takoda Collins was allowed to sleep on occasion, on a lawn chair with a bloody tarp as a blanket. Police would also find a dismantled camera in the attic. This camera was actually used to watch Takoda while he was in the attic. And Al McLean's fiance would say that Al had actually disconnected it once he realized that Takoda was unresponsive. And while at the hospital, a detective would notice that Al McLean was talking to himself, and what he said would leave the detective with chills. Al would say to himself, "He must have drowned because I didn't beat his butt that bad today." On the night before Takoda Collins' death, Al McLean's fiance and her sister would say that Al had repeatedly beat Takoda very violently. He would punch Takoda in the stomach incredibly hard and multiple times. And they would hear Takoda begging his father to not hit him anymore. He would say, "Please, no more." And he just would not stop. And I want to note that Amanda and her sister could have done something. They could have called 911. They could have reported Al numerous times over these years of abuse, and they chose not to. And a 10-year-old is dead because of them. The next morning after this abuse, Takoda Collins was coming down from the attic, but he was very wobbly and he was kind of leaning on walls and things like that to hold himself up because he was in so much pain. And as he's coming down the attic stairs, he's fallen multiple times because he can't stand up. And Al McLean's response to this was to elbow his child incredibly hard and send him back upstairs. And once Takoda got upstairs, Al ordered him to put the folding chair away. And of course, Takoda is in a lot of pain, so he's moving incredibly slow, and this enrages Al McLean. As punishment for moving slowly, Al McLean would force Takoda to lay on his stomach on the ground, and Al would get on top of the boy's back and press all of his weight down on top of him. At one point, he even reached up to the ceiling. He placed his hands on the ceiling so that he could push harder onto the boy's back. And then he would make Takoda stand up and resume a position as punishment. Al would go downstairs, grab a bottle of hot sauce, and take it back up to the attic where he would pour it on the bottom half of Takoda. And apparently this was a daily punishment that Takoda had received from Al. And still not satisfied with how much abuse he enacted on this poor child, he grabs him by the ear and drags drags him down those attic stairs and into the bathroom. He told Takoda once in the bathroom to clean his shorts. And remember, Takoda is in so much pain and his body is failing him and he's moving slowly. And again, this enrages Al McClane. So he draws a bath and he places Takoda in it and begins to drown the boy. All while Amanda, his fiance, is sitting in the living room listening to this. Amanda would say that she could hear the child splashing, obviously fighting against his father, and gasping for air. And she just sat there in the living room and did nothing. And then after he pulled him out of the bathtub, he grabbed a broken chair leg and would rape Takoda with it. In a police interview, Al McClane would say to the officers that he inserted the chair leg into Takoda because his son liked that type of thing and that Takoda was into that stuff. But he quickly asserted to detectives that he himself was not gay, although detectives hadn't asked that question. Al would plead guilty to murder, rape, kidnapping, and 3 counts of child endangerment. He was sentenced to life in prison and won't be eligible for parole for at least 40 or 50 years. Al's fiance, Amanda Hines, pleaded guilty to other charges, including manslaughter and child endangerment. She was sentenced to 22 to 27 years in prison. Jennifer, Amanda's sister, pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. As you're listening to this case, I'm sure you're having some of the same feelings that I was having. The whole time I was questioning, why didn't anybody do something? Of course, Amanda and her sister, Jennifer, could have done something. They could have called 911 at any point, and they chose not to. They encouraged this behavior. But what about Takoda's school? And what about his biological mother? What about doctors? The truth is, numerous people could have saved Takoda Collins. There's actually reports to CPS from Takoda's elementary school. They noticed right away that Takoda really needed help. He would come smelling like feces, and he was covered in dirty, disgusting clothing. They would send him to the nurse and she would wash his clothes. They even donated clothing to Takoda so that he could wear fresh, clean clothes to school. But Al McClane would become enraged. At one point, he called the school that his son was not allowed under any circumstances to see the nurse. This is a red flag in itself. What parent wouldn't want their child to see a school nurse if they needed to? Not only did he come smelling terribly, but teachers noted that he came with really terrible haircuts. And court documents would say that this was done on purpose, that Al McClane wanted his son to go to school and be ridiculed by other children, not only for smelling bad, but for looking different. This poor child didn't have any safe place. He couldn't go to school without being teased. He couldn't be at home without being beaten brutally. And this child deserved dignity and love and respect and kindness. And he was just met with so much violence in his life. Al would also request daily updates from Takoda's teachers. These updates were told to Amanda and she would tell Al, and he would dish out punishment if Takoda didn't get a glowing review from his teachers. A lot of the times he would come home from school at night and he'd have to stand in the living room in a really uncomfortable and hard pose and hold a heavy book bag. And this went on until he went to bed. And although Child Protective Services was involved, Al McClane was ready with an excuse every single time, and he had coached Takoda on what to say and how to act. And every single time CPS became involved, Al would take his rage out on Takoda. And this is something Takoda couldn't prevent. He couldn't help that people were coming to his house to check on him. He didn't call them there. He was just a victim in every single way. In November of 2018, Takoda Collins had to go to the hospital because he quote unquote launched himself out of the attic window. Doctors would actually treat Takoda in the presence of Al and his fiance Amanda. So this child is at a hospital where he can receive help, but his abusers are sitting in the room with him and there's nothing he can do. I want to note that although they said Takoda launched himself out a window, we don't know if that's true or not. Takoda could have been thrown out the window during one of Al's vicious beatings, but I do believe that Takoda had tried to escape that day. I firmly believe that Takoda knew his life was in danger and the only way out of that attic that was kept locked was to go out that window. I came to this conclusion because after that incident, he was locked in the basement until Al had boarded up all the windows to make sure the incident didn't happen again. I think he was worried about Takoda getting out of the house and telling someone what was happening. And what about Takoda's biological mother? Where was she?
This falls on CPS here in Dayton. This falls on them. This falls on Wisconsin. They should have looked into it. They should have done more.
Robin Collins says she didn't speak with her 10-year-old son Takoda as much as she was supposed to. She says a phone call last spring left her feeling troubled.
I spoke with him actually back in May, but I could tell that his father was hovering over him, telling him what to say.
After that call, Collins tells us she went to her local Child Protective Services office in Wisconsin with concerns about Takoda's care under his father, Al Mutahan McLean. She says she also called Children's Services in Montgomery County, but says she didn't hear back from either office. So that month, she called 911 asking police for a welfare check.
They told me that everything seemed to be taken care of, that he seemed to be doing just fine, that they didn't have any concerns.
Documents previously uncovered by 2 News show staff members with Dayton Public Schools reported suspected abuse 17 times to Montgomery County Children's Services.
A person can only call and tell you so much of you not doing anything that they feel like them calling isn't doing anything.
Collins says she plans to take legal action against Children's Services in Montgomery County and in Wisconsin.
I'll be suing as much of them as I can, and it's not because I want the money, it's because they need to pay.
As you can see from the video, she actively was not involved in her child's life, and she even admitted that she didn't call in and check on him as much as she should. And when she did, she kind of figured that Al McLean was standing over him and telling him what to say and monitoring the conversation. She supposedly reported it to CPS, but they didn't do anything. Takoda Collins was an innocent boy. He was a 10-year-old child who deserved none of this. He was failed by every single person in his life and by a system who was supposed to protect him. I'm outraged, I'm disgusted, I'm mortified, and about 100 other things I can't even think of right now. This case was actually a really hard case for me to cover. I'm actually getting emotional just talking about it. There were so many opportunities for this boy to be saved and to be put in a loving home where he could get the help that he needed. Instead, he was left in an attic where he was tortured every single day of his life. And although these cases are incredibly disturbing and they're hard to hear about, they need to be reported on because we need to make sure that we're holding these systems accountable, and children like Takoda Collins are getting the help they desperately need. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Check out some other videos until the next upload, and if you have a suggestion for a case, pop it in the comments and I'm going to get to as many of them as possible. See you next time.